I think I accidentally made a sequel to my last video, not intentionally. I finished We Were Never Meant to Be This Reachable, linked right here, uploaded it, mentally removed the entire subject from my brain, which is usually how this works, and then realized that I had spent all the time talking about how much access other people now have to us without really talking about the thing that is supposed to limit that access: privacy. And privacy is one of those words that becomes less useful the longer you steer at it, because, what are we actually describing here? I'm sitting in my room right now. The door is closed. Nobody can see me except the camera, which I invited, so that seems fair. By probably every pre-industrial standard, I am enjoying an absurd amount of physical privacy. I have an entire room in which nobody's sleeping, eating, working, receiving visitors, or storing grain beside me. Very luxurious, At the same time, my phone knows where I am. My browser has a fairly humiliating record of everything I have become briefly interested in during the last several years. There are companies that know what I buy, systems that know when I log in, photographs of me stored on devices I have never seen, and somewhere there is probably an advertisement profile that has developed a more coherent theory of my personality that I have. So, am I private right now? Because apparently having nobody in the room and having nobody in your business are not remotely the same thing. And once I began reading the history of this, the whole category started getting messy, actually. Much messier than I expected. I thought I was researching the history of people gradually getting more private lives, crowded houses becoming divided houses, shared spaces becoming personal rooms, letters becoming legally protected. Then eventually we arrive at passwords and data protection, and everyone becomes terrified of cookies. Nice progression, extremely convenient. Unfortunately, history rarely has the decency to organize itself like that. There were Roman houses where strangers could enter certain areas as part of everyday social and political life, while other spaces were restricted. Medieval people could spend an extraordinary amount of time physically close to other people and still have very strong ideas about conversations you were not supposed to repeat. Spaces you enter only under certain conditions, things you simply pretended not to notice. Centuries later, people were folding letters in incredibly elaborate ways, specifically so that someone could tell if another person had opened them. So clearly, people did not suddenly discover the concept of mind your own business in 1890. What changes is that boundary itself. Sometimes it is around a room, sometimes around a conversation, sometimes around a letter. Eventually, it gets wrapped around an image, a medical record, a government file, a piece of data. And the part I find much more interesting, because this is where the history becomes slightly less wholesome, is that the ability to draw that boundary was never distributed equally. Some people could close the door. Some people were expected to remain available on the other side of it. And sometimes calling something private protected the person inside. Sometimes it protected what was being done to them. Welcome, I'm Angelina. But we will get there, because before privacy became a right or a database problem or something you click accept all under because you cannot be bothered to read 12 pages of legal text, it had to work in a world where being physically alone was much less ordinary than it is for many of us now. The easiest mistake to make here is to look at how people lived in the past and assume they must have had no privacy at all, because honestly, by modern standards, some of these households sounded like my personal nightmare. Too many people, too few rooms, servants coming and going, visitors appearing during the day, family members everywhere. And depending on the period and your social position, work might also be happening in the same building. There was often no clean distinction between home, office, shop, and place where 18 other people know exactly what are you doing. But that is exactly why using our own idea of privacy gets a little dangerous. Take a wealthy Roman house. The Roman domus was obviously home, but it could also function as a place of business, political networking, receiving clients, displaying wealth, basically part residence, part workplace, part very elaborate LinkedIn profile made of marble. Vitruvius, the Roman architect, actually distinguishes between areas of the house that outsiders could enter and spaces where they were not supposed to go without an invitation. So already the line between private and public was there, it just wasn't drawn neatly around the front door. And I really like this because I think without noticing, we tend to imagine privacy geographically. Outside is public, inside is private. Bedroom is very private. Bathroom is almost sacred territory. There is a little mental map. A Roman household did not necessarily work like that. Someone could be inside your house and still not have permission to enter a particular room, participate in a particular conversation, or behave as though the entire household was equally available to them. The same problem comes up when we move into the medieval period, and I don't want to spend too much time on sleeping arrangements because I already subjected everyone to the history of slave in another video, the link is right here, but shared physical space was completely compatible with selective access. A chamber could be used for sleeping, yes, but also for private conversation, counsel, intimacy, religious practice, receiving particular people and excluding others. And even that word private needs a little caution because access often depended on hierarchy. The lord of a household withdrawing into a chamber is not quite the same historic experience as a servant one in 5 minutes alone. There is actually a passage in Piers Plowman complaining about wealthy people retreating from the communal hall to eat privately in parlors and chambers, which I find fascinating because what looks to us like an obvious improvement, congratulations, you finally got a dining room, could also look to someone at the same time like social withdrawal, even arrogance. And this is where I started becoming less interested in whether people were physically alone, because apparently privacy could exist in a room full of people, as long as everyone understood that some things were not theirs to enter, hear, repeat, or acknowledge. Which makes the next development slightly strange because over the following centuries, Europeans started putting more and more effort into making those boundaries physical. If you want to understand how seriously people were beginning to take separation inside the home, one of the best places to look is, weirdly enough, at curtains, not philosophical treatises, curtains. Because in an early modern household, especially a fairly busy one, privacy was often something you had to physically manufacture out of whatever was available. A piece of fabric around a bed could create a temporary enclosure. Furniture could divide a room. A small cabinet or study could remove someone from the general traffic of the house without requiring an entirely separate building plan. And I think this is easy to underestimate because we live inside architecture that has already made most of these decisions for us. I don't wake up every morning and appreciate the political significance of my bedroom door. I just close it. The wall is there, the door is there, everybody understands what the door means, and none of this requires negotiation unless you have particularly determined relatives. But early modern European households were much more mixed spaces. Family lived there, obviously, but so might servants and apprentices, and people could work there, sell things there, receive customers there, conduct business there. The modern idea that home is the private place you retreat to after leaving the public world of work would have been difficult to explain to someone whose workshop was downstairs and whose apprentice was also sleeping under the same roof. So people begin creating these little zones of selective access, and eventually the architecture itself becomes more elaborate. This is where the corridor enters the story, and I promise I'm not about to claim that somebody invented privacy by inventing a hallway, because historians have suffered enough. But the change in floor plans is genuinely interesting. In many older houses, rooms open directly into other rooms, which meant that getting from one part of the house to another could involve walking through spaces that were currently being used by somebody else. A corridor changes that. Suddenly, movement through the building can happen without passing through every room along the way. And yes, privacy is part of that story, but it is where the evidence gets annoying in a useful way. Historian Lena Cohen-Orlin, writing about Tudor London, is very cautious about reading every extra room and doorway as proof that people had discovered a new passion for individual privacy. Houses were also organized around work, servants, status, display, hospitality, even just the practical problem of managing a lot of people. Which means that a larger house with more separated rooms doesn't automatically tell us that its owner desperately wanted quiet time to journal. Actually, sometimes greater separation tells us something much less sentimental. It tells us who had enough status to withdraw. A household master could retire to a chamber. A servant still had to be available. A wealthy person could remove themselves from communal space and call it privacy. Somebody lower in the household hierarchy might simply be expected to disappear when they were no longer needed and reappear immediately when they were. And once you notice that, the history starts looking less like humanity slowly acquiring privacy and more like certain people acquiring the power to decide when other people were allowed near them. Which is interesting enough on its own, except that people were already building another kind of boundary at the same time, one that didn't surround the room at all. For a surprisingly long time, if you wanted to send somebody a private letter, you could not just put it in an envelope, lick the edge, and hope the postal service respect your emotional boundaries. The letter itself had to become the envelope, and people became extremely good at this. There is an entire field of research now called letter locking, which studies the ways people folded, tucked, cut, tied, and sealed letters before the mass-produced envelope became normal. Some techniques were fairly simple, others looked like the sender had briefly retrained as an engineer. You could fold the sheet so that opening damaged part of the structure, run a paper lock through a slit, add wax, sometimes create several layers of protection, and the point was not necessarily to make the letter impossible to open, because obviously, given enough determination, paper is not a fortress, but to make interference visible. And I love this because it makes privacy incredibly physical. Your thoughts could leave the room without you, travel through the hands of complete strangers, cross cities or borders, and still carry a little mechanism saying, you may transfer this, but you're not supposed to read it. There is a collection known as the Bean Collection, thousands of undelivered letters from 17th century Europe, and hundreds of them survive still locked. Researchers have actually used X-ray techniques to virtually unfold some of these letters without breaking the original seals, which is slightly ironic because we have now developed extraordinary advanced technology specifically to violate the privacy of people who have been dead for 300 years, but in a very respectful academic way. And the existence of all of this matters because it complicates the idea that informational privacy is some very recent anxiety. People care deeply about who could read their correspondence. They spend time and materials making unauthorized reading detectable. What changes later is not that information suddenly becomes private, but the scale of the systems capable of accessing it. There is a particularly good example from Britain in 1844 involving Giuseppe Mazzini, an Italian political exile living in London. Mazzini discovered that his letters had apparently been opened by the British Post Office, copied, resealed, and sent on in a way designed to conceal what had happened. And this became a political scandal. Parliament ended up debating the government's power to secretly open correspondence, and what I find interesting here is that the argument sounds strangely familiar. The authorities had reasons: national security, political intelligence, public order, and the person being watched had the fairly understandable position that a sealed private letter should not quietly become government reading material halfway to its destination. So by the 19th century, privacy was no longer just about controlling who entered your room. You could lock the door, sit completely alone, write something meant for one person, and discover that the real intrusion had happened somewhere between you and them. And very soon, even sealing the letter would stop being the main problem because new technologies were making it possible for information about you to travel without you choosing to send it anything at all. I'm sorry, I had to turn my lights on. One of the first major modern privacy panics was caused by a technology that now seems almost aggressively harmless: the camera. Not even some government surveillance camera, just photography becoming faster, cheaper, and much easier to reproduce alongside a press industry that had discovered, quite sensibly from a business perspective, that people were extremely interested in other people's business. By the end of the 19th century, this created a slightly new problem. Someone no longer had to intercept your letter, enter your house, or overhear your conversation to make part of your private life public. A photograph could be taken, a story could be printed, details about your family or your relationships, your habits could suddenly circulate among thousands of people who had never met you and never would. And this is the context in which in 1890, two American lawyers, Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis, published this enormously influential article called The Right to Privacy. It is one of those legal texts that people quote so often that it starts sounding as though two men sat down one afternoon and invented privacy, which they obviously did not. People had been sealing letters, restricting rooms, and hiding things from one another for a very long time. What Warren and Brandeis were reacting to was more specific. The older legal idea of intrusion was heavily tied to physical things, your property, your body, and your home. But what happens when nobody trespasses on your land and you still feel that something has been taken from you? They write about photography and newspapers with a level of irritation that honestly feels very familiar. New technology had made it possible to expose domestic life to an audience at a scale that earlier legal protections were not really designed for. And I think this is where the history gets interesting because the thing being protected begins to move away from space. Your private life is no longer only wherever your body happens to be. It can exist in an image, in a newspaper column, in a description of something you did yesterday, in somebody else's knowledge of you. Which also means that closing the door becomes less useful. You can have the most beautifully secluded Victorian drawing room imaginable. Curtains closed, servants dismissed, tea probably occurring somewhere, and still discover that a version of your life is circulating outside the house without you. Sarah Igo described this wider modern development as privacy becoming increasingly detached from physical place, and I think that is really the useful way to look at it. The 19th century does not suddenly make information private. We already saw that with letters. What it does is create systems that can reproduce, distribute, and preserve information about a person much more efficiently. And once information can travel independently of you, there is another problem waiting behind it because governments, employers, doctors, insurers, and institutions are beginning to collect it deliberately. At that point, you're not dealing with one nosy journalist anymore. You're starting to become a record. Being turned into a record sounds very bureaucratic, which is appropriate because a huge part of 20th century privacy history is basically paperwork becoming terrifying. And I mean paperwork in the broadest possible sense. Governments want to know where people live, employers keep personal files, hospitals keep medical records, insurance companies need information to calculate risk, banks need to know who you are, schools keep transcripts, census offices count you, tax authorities would also very much like to know what you have been doing, financially speaking. None of this is particularly sinister on its own. Actually, most of it is necessary for a modern state to function without operating entirely on vibes. But the interesting thing is what happens when all these little pieces of information begin to accumulate. Sarah Igo calls the modern American subject the known citizen, and I really like that phrase because it captures something that is easy to miss. Modern life gives you more opportunities to disappear physically into private space, while at the same time making you increasingly visible on paper. You can live alone and still exist in 20 different filing cabinets. The social security number is a really good example of how strange this development was. When social security numbers were introduced in the United States in the 1930s, people did not immediately treat them like the secret private identifiers we tend to imagine today. There were periods when people displayed them much more casually, even had them printed or engraved on personal objects, because the number itself was not yet surrounded by the enormous network of databases and identifier verification systems that would later make it sensitive. And that distinction matters. A piece of information is not private simply because of what it contains. Sometimes it becomes private because of what other systems can do with it. Knowing my name is not especially alarming. Knowing my name and connecting it instantly to my address, medical history, employment, finances, movements, and relationships is a very different proposition. By the 1960s, this was becoming difficult to ignore. In the United States, there were serious discussions about creating a national data center that could bring together large amounts of federal statistical information. And almost immediately, people started worrying about what centralized computer systems might mean for individual privacy, which I find comforting in a strange way because apparently being afraid that computers know too much about us did not begin when somebody's grandmother joined Facebook. Congressional hearings were already discussing computers and invasions of privacy in the 1960s, and by 1974, the United States had passed the Privacy Act, trying to place limits on how federal agencies collected, used, and disclosed personal records. So at this point, the privacy problem has become almost inverted. For most of the earlier history, we were trying to keep unwanted people out. Now, the person accessing you may not even be a person. It might be a system retrieving a file, comparing one record with another, making a connection between two facts that you never thought of as connected. And once computers make those connections cheap and fast, it becomes increasingly difficult to say where one private context ends and another one begins. I think one of the reasons privacy became so confusing once computers entered the picture is that secrecy stopped being a very useful way to think about it. Because most of the information I would consider private is not actually secret. My doctor can know things about my house. My bank obviously knows how much money I have, unfortunately. My friends know where I live. My university knows my grades. Their photographs I am perfectly happy for 20 people to see and would be absolutely horrified to see projected onto a screen in front of 500 strangers. The information itself has not changed, the audience has. This is where the work of philosopher Helen Nissenbaum becomes especially useful, which, when you say it in normal human language, is actually very intuitive. You tell different things to different people because those relationships have different rules. There are things you tell your doctor because you are in a medical context. Things you tell your closest friend because you are in a friendship. Things you tell your employer because they need them to employ you. And ideally, the three of them do not form a committee and start exchanging notes. We have always done this. Even the Roman house we talked about earlier worked through selective access. Different people could enter different spaces. A medieval chamber could be accessible to some people and not others. A letter was written for one recipient even though dozens of hands might physically carry it. So maybe the modern internet did not create an entirely new privacy problem so much as make it much harder to keep these contexts separated. Researchers Alice Morwick and Dana Boyd used the term context collapse for what happens when audiences that would normally exist separately are suddenly pushed together online. And honestly, social media is almost comically good at this. You post something for your friends, and technically it is also visible to your aunt, and no classmate you have not spoken to since 2018, somebody from work, your ex, 3 strangers in Brazil, and depending on your luck, a future employer conducting amateur archaeology on your Instagram account. Offline, we're constantly adjusting ourselves without really thinking about it. Not because we are fake, but because human relationships have context. I do not speak to my professor exactly the way I speak to my best friend, and I sincerely hope neither of them considers this a betrayal. Online, those boundaries become porous, and even worse, privacy becomes networked. Other people can upload photographs of you, tag you, mention where you were, share something you said. Your private life is partly being produced by people who are not you. So by this point, privacy has moved very far from the locked bedroom door. But there is another complication here that I think is much more serious than anything Facebook can do with an embarrassing photograph, because sometimes the problem is not that private boundaries are violated. Sometimes the problem is that everybody agrees to respect them. The phrase, "it's a private matter," can be incredibly comforting right up until you realize how much violence has historically been hidden behind it. And this is the point where I think the whole story of privacy becomes much harder to treat as a simple history of people gaining freedom, because for most of this video, we have been following boundaries as they become stronger. A room you can withdraw into, a letter other people are not supposed to read, a legal right against intrusion, information that institutions are not supposed to distribute wherever they like. Usually, the person outside the boundary is the threat. But what if the threat is already inside? Feminist scholars have spent decades pointing out that the traditional separation between public and private life was never politically neutral. The public world, law, citizenship, work, government, was historically associated much more strongly with men, while marriage, family, sexuality, reproduction, and domestic life were pushed into this category of the private. And calling something private does more than describe where it happens. It can also tell everybody else that they should stay out of it. This becomes particularly disturbing when you look at domestic violence. Legal historian Riva Siegel has written about the history of wife beating in Anglo-American law, and what is interesting is that explicit legal doctrines allowing husbands to physically discipline their wives could weaken or disappear, while another idea remained surprisingly durable, that violence inside marriage was somehow different from violence between strangers because marriage belonged to a private sphere that courts and police should be reluctant to enter. So the language changes. The underlying reluctance to interfere can survive, and feminist activists in the 20th century had to fight not only against domestic violence itself, but against the categories surrounding it. The idea that what happened between husband and wife was a family problem, a personal problem, something unfortunate perhaps, but still basically private. Elizabeth Schneider actually calls this the violence of privacy, which I think is such an uncomfortable phrase because privacy is normally the thing we imagine protecting the vulnerable person. Here, privacy could protect the institution around them instead. The history of marital rape makes the same contradiction even harder to ignore. For a very long time, legal systems treated sexual violence with marriage differently precisely because marriage was imagined as a special private relationship, governed by assumptions about consent, duty, and the limits of state interference that would be completely unacceptable in most other contexts. And I mean, none of this means privacy is somehow anti-feminist. Quite the opposite. Women have also had to fight enormously hard for bodily privacy, reproductive autonomy, confidential medical care, control over correspondence, freedom from surveillance, even just the possibility of being alone without somebody else claiming a right to their time or body. Which is why I don't think the answer can simply be more privacy. Sometimes women needed society to leave them alone. Sometimes they needed society to stop leaving them alone. And once you put those two histories next to each other, I think we need a much more careful idea of what a private boundary is actually supposed to protect, because apparently the closed door itself tells us almost nothing. I think this is the point where privacy becomes slightly inconvenient to talk about, because the moment you say that privacy can protect violence, it sounds as if the obvious conclusion should be that privacy itself is somehow suspicious. And that doesn't really work either. I still want the door. I want people to knock before they come into my room. I want private conversations to remain private. I want my medical information to stay with people who actually need it, rather than becoming an exciting new marketing opportunity. I want to be able to exist somewhere without constantly performing for an audience. And after making an entire video about why we were never meant to be this reachable, I'm certainly not going to sit here and argue that everyone should have more access to us. What changed for me while researching this was more specific. At the beginning, I kept thinking about privacy as a kind of barrier. You build the wall, close the door, seal the letter, create the password, restrict the database, and now something private exists on one side and everybody else stays on the other. But history makes that image much less stable. The Roman house had boundaries, but they depended on who you were. Medieval and early modern households had private spaces, but the right to withdraw was shaped by hierarchy. A sealed letter could keep one person out while a government quietly claimed the authority to open it. Modern law could defend the home from interference while treating violence inside that home as somebody else's private concern. And today, a platform can technically respect the fact that you shared something voluntarily while moving that information into context you never imagined when you shared it. So I don't think the history of privacy is really a history of us slowly getting more of it. Sometimes privacy expands, sometimes it contracts, sometimes a new form appears because an older boundary stops working. Photography creates a problem walls cannot solve. Databases create a problem secrecy cannot solve. Domestic violence creates a problem where respecting the boundary too much can become part of the harm. And through all of this, the question that keeps surviving is not simply whether something is private. It is who gets to decide that it is. Who decides which room can be entered, which letter can be opened, which information can travel, which relationship is beyond public scrutiny, and whose wish to be left alone actually counts. Which also explains why privacy can feel so contradictory. It protects autonomy precisely because it gives us some control over those boundaries. But the boundary itself has no moral wisdom. A closed door doesn't know whether it is protecting someone from intrusion or protecting someone else from accountability. So I still think privacy matters enormously. I just think the history makes it much harder to talk about it, though more privacy automatically means more freedom. Anyway, that's what I found when I started asking whether privacy used to be normal.